Welcome to what will hopefully be the first of many Q&As with our curator. So I'm joined by Sadiah Boonstra, the curator of On the Nature of Botanical Gardens. What for you were some of the main challenges in curating?
One of the main issues was that there was actually not a lot of research yet about how botanical gardens in Indonesia specifically contributed to empire building. I largely took all the literature that I could find on botanical gardens in Indonesia and botanical gardens as a tool for empire building. And then it turned out that a lot of artists in Indonesia were working not necessarily, exactly within the same framework, but there were a lot of artists working on nature, on botanical gardens, or trying to find alternative ways of knowledge about nature, different ways of thinking about nature, being with nature, sensing nature, things like that. One of the main challenges in that sense was how to bring that into an exhibition and how to transport artworks that could be very tactile into the Netherlands.
Thinking about negotiation and having to compromise on certain artworks that you did want, were there any elements of the exhibition that you refused to compromise on?
I think I like to think of myself as someone who's open for discussion, but that's not for me to judge. But but to me, exhibitions are always negotiation is really always for me part of making exhibitions. And one of the most important things, or maybe the most important thing to me, is that I think it's important to stay true to the artists, to their voices, and therefore also to the integrity of the artworks. So I think in the end, it's really about that. And it's about, for me at least, taking the artworks and the artists as a starting point and make sure that we find a way that they get the best platform and the best way to be displayed. So it's more about creating the right framework in which the artists can be heard, in which the artworks can be their best selves, and in which the audiences have the best way of accessing the works and therefore the artist's voices.
A little bit in the introduction to the exhibition is this idea of decoloniality from Walter Manolo. How do you personally approach that as a framework? What does it mean to curate decolonially?
So when I started thinking about the topic of botanical gardens, initially I was actually quite reluctant because I don't know that much about plants or about nature, but in my previous work and actually throughout my career, I've been working on decolonizing history and heritage. And so I thought, if I can take that approach, then I could do something with the botanical gardens too, especially since they've been playing such a big role in building empires around the globe. There are artists who really are very critical about the colonial past, about colonial history, and are really working towards a decolonization of history, of Indonesian history, and critically deconstruct that history in very many different ways. There are very many artists in Indonesia who are actually doing that. But at the same time, there were also a lot of artists who were not necessarily engaged with kind of like critical discourses, but were doing their own thing in revisiting or rethinking knowledges about nature that were already present in Indonesia pre-colonial times, that have always been there and that are still there, and they just wanted to connect to that, reconnect to those kind of like knowledges. And so throughout my research, I kind of like discovered that, and then I remembered Walter Mignolo, and he just, well, not just, but his most recent work on decoloniality addresses the concept, but also the practices of decoloniality. So then I actually thought like, well, this is actually what is already happening in Indonesia. And even if he writes, from a different context, mostly in Americas, it's what I saw that artists in Indonesia are actually doing at the moment. So it's not necessarily me doing it, but it was more that I saw like this is actually happening.
How did you, as a curator, navigate this risk of reproducing the more dominant colonial narrative of botanical gardens that people might already know?
I think based on the research that I did, so given the fact that all these artists were actually already dealing with these kind of issues, what I felt was more of my role was to provide a platform and a framework for them to have all these, to present all these different voices. So I think that also explains the wide variety in approaches and also the wide variety in mediums that are in the exhibition. So we have installations, there is a painting, there is film, there are shadow puppets. So it just gave rise to a myriad of different forms that I think also reflected all the different perspectives and approaches to the topic. And that was also important to me to kind of like show that there are so many different voices in Indonesia, and that all deserve a place and a platform to be heard.